Vikram Aiyer has had and still has what I see as a very fascinating career. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and where he works on issues of economic justice and gender justice, and other issues as well. And previously, he served as the Senior Policy Advisor for Innovation and Manufacturing Policy in the Obama White House, as well as Chief of Staff for the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. After leaving the Obama administration, Mr. Aiyer spearheaded the public policy and strategic communications practice for the tech startup Postmates, which some of you may have heard of, until it was acquired by Uber. And when he was there, he led their global government affairs, labor negotiations, and advocacy efforts on issues ranging from privacy to taxes to the future of work and the gig economy. It's a whole range of things that he worked on when he was there.
As Rebecca mentioned, I feel like I've had the opportunity to work in the public sector, the private sector, and now kind of civil society, third-party advocacy groups that are focused on a lot of racial justice and social justice work. And I want to share a little bit about kind of why I took that path, but maybe I'll just start with one overarching sentence about it, which sort of feels like if joining the Obama administration or joining the federal government around the time of 2008, 2009 was about a moment in history where our country was in the Great Recession, and there's a housing crisis, and the big three auto manufacturers needed to get bailed out and banks were closing. My time there felt a lot about how does government invest in the economy to kickstart startup growth or kickstart small business growth and get jobs going again. I then felt that coming into the private sector was about how do you actually build, create jobs and do so while butting up against the policies and regulations that government creates. So sort of kind of going to the other side of the equation and being able to learn that. And then now I sort of feel that particularly if we all pay attention to what's happening across the country, no matter your political persuasion, or if you're happy or not about who might be in the Oval Office, there are attacks on voting rights. There are attacks on Black youth in our community. There are attacks on transgender youth in our communities. And so I think that while it was very important for me to learn how do you invest in an economy from the perch of government, and how do you build up an economy from the perch of a private technology firm, that if that economy doesn't actually work for everyone, for people being able to access it in the first place, then something is structurally wrong at a root level. And so that's kind of what took me in broad strokes from the Obama years to tech company years to now the ACLU, which, as many of you may be familiar with, is a civil rights organization. And I think having an understanding of those three legs of the stool in a large way has informed my own personal political orientation, but also just given me a lot more of a deep appreciation that if we're able to bring more stakeholders together than working apart or pitting against these tribal entities that typically informs our politics, then we can get a lot of things done. And I think having seen how businesses can cooperate or not cooperate with the government, or how racial justice issues can block or not block somebody from getting a job in the workforce, all of that is intertwined and all of that is interconnected. And that's what I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about today. For me personally, though, I moved to DC when I was actually 20 years old. I left college a little early. I was still using my brother's fake ID to get into bars in downtown DC. It got quickly confiscated from me, but I'll always cherish that memory of when I could pretend I was of a drinking age. But I mentioned that because I kind of professionally and personally grew up in Washington. I was born here in the Bay Area. I'm in San Francisco right now, and my family is still out here. But I was drawn to the overall DMV area to want to try and work in politics. I ended up working for a member of Congress for a while, who's now in the Senate, a gentleman named Ed Markey. I worked for a former mayor in Washington, D.C., a guy named Adrian Fenty. As the bio suggested, I joined the Obama administration initially as a speechwriter for one of the cabinet members in the Secretary of Commerce's team, and then more so in policy areas that affected trade and intellectual property, and how do we sort of build back our manufacturing sector and our startup sector. And all of that for me was very instructive, because there was a point in time in which I felt like there are processes in which the government often don't get to, most constituents don't get to see every day. And that's a shame, right? And it's sometimes you can blame government for not advertising it enough, but it's also a shame if local constituents don't know about it enough. And I'll give you an example. We know that there are government agencies like the Small Business Administration, that if you're a young first-time entrepreneur trying to bootstrap your own business, there are loans that get granted out from the federal government if one applies. You can do this across research areas. If it's NASA does this, the Department of Energy does this, the Small Business Administration does this. And yet we kind of think when it comes to building an economy in America, that unless you have a friend who has a lot of money, or you have a lot of money, or you know an investor, a venture capitalist that can give you millions of dollars for your startup idea, that we're sort of down on our luck. And while maybe there are reasons to believe that is true, there's also ample resources that the government brings you. And I think during the recession, and I had the opportunity to work with Mike very closely on this, it was very important for the Obama White House to try and decentralize those resources as far out of just the District of Columbia and into the homes and backyards of Americans throughout the country. And so we try to tackle that problem from everything from expanding the physical footprint of the Patent and Trademark Office outside of where it's headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia, and to places like Detroit, Michigan, or San Jose, California, or Denver, Colorado. Try to get more of an interest in science and technology, so that way folks could be educated younger into classrooms at the K through 12 level. Michelle Obama had an initiative to try and empower women and girls in STEM fields, and we would partner with groups like the Girl Scouts of America to actually create new patches that were focused on science and technology as a means of kind of disseminating out new curricula and new areas of curricula focus for the Obama administration in the classroom level. We would try and make sure that we were promoting new resources that the White House was bringing online to help small manufacturers build things. And sometimes building things like a device can be prohibitive if you don't have the expensive tooling and the machinery that exists. So we opened up the Department of Energy national labs, so that way everyday entrepreneurs could access them with more rigor. And so all of these things I mentioned, because sometimes when we talk about an economy not working for everybody, a lot of that is just trying to figure out where we find resources. And I think the federal government, and there's a great partnership that Mike and I had in our jobs, has more of a responsibility to tell the world about its resources and connect people to those resources. And that's not just an academic exercise, that is very, very, very real. Because right now there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families who could use the resource of child tax credits that the Biden administration has issued during COVID, or could have used the help of unemployment or stimulus dollars that Trump and Biden have pushed out. But sometimes people just don't even know where to access this, or there's a lack of trust in government I'm not going to give the IRS my information. Screw that. I will sacrifice my lack of trust in the government, I will sacrifice money coming into my bank account because of mistrust in government. Or even worse, there's a lot of dollars of rental relief that are out there right now for tenants that are fearing eviction. And sometimes people don't know where to go and get those resources. So I think one macro theme in life is that even though government can be sometimes overly political or overly bureaucratic and technical in terms of how to navigate it, there are resources. And I think that we have a collective mandate, whether you work inside of government or outside government, to call for decentralizing it and engaging with the public and making sure that those processes are fine-tuned and easier for Americans of all constituencies. In my experience, the main constituencies that I worked with, kind of working on manufacturing and trade and intellectual property, they happen to be businesses. So at the end of my time in DC, I was starting to feel like, it's one thing to allege what's good for growth and the economy, and it's another thing to actually be on the other side of those policies and regulations. We can do all the philosophizing that we want all day from the White House and have a cool email address and be able to tell my mom and dad, hey, I saw Barack Obama at something today. But that doesn't mean anything unless like businesses are actually able to thrive and actually able to build and hire people and pay good wages and create good quality benefits. And so I wanted to experience what it was like to go to a private company. And I think in 2017, tech firms were having a bit of for now we can call it a honeymoon period. I feel like there was a celebration of technology can do anything. When I was growing up, everyone who had an idea for a restaurant would share it. Or then if you had an idea for a food truck, you would share it. And in 2015, 16, everybody would just be like at a holiday party drinking wine, being like, I got an idea for an app. I got an idea for an app. And there was this celebration of entrepreneurship in this country that you too could potentially drop out of school and start your own company in your dorm or in your garage, and that would be celebrated. And that's always kind of been core to America's spirit, building things. But it really hit a fever head in 2015, 16, 17. The White House, Obama was hiring a ton of people from Twitter and Facebook and these companies out here in Silicon Valley. And so I kind of thought, if I want to learn what it's like to participate in the economy from that side of the equation, maybe a tech company would be an interesting place to go. Now we know, of course, tech is not celebrated and beloved in the same way. It is so ubiquitous in the entirety of our lives that we have to ask very serious questions about how we build rules of the road around it. And even if we're all dependent on it, I think asking what those rules ought to be, doesn't mean that we don't have to use it, right? We don't have to feel ashamed that we're getting goods from Amazon, but we should ask and hold lawmakers and our corporations to account if we don't think that everyone working on Amazon is getting a fair shake. And that experience for me defined the 4 years after I left Washington, because I ended up working at a tech company, Postmates, which you may be familiar with, is a food delivery app. And that app actually helps connect people to local merchants so you can get goods delivered. During the pandemic, I think we all became a bit more familiar with food delivery, whether we relied on it heavily or not. But in 2016, 2017, it was pretty novel, because I don't know if there was anywhere outside of maybe New York City that was cool enough to deliver a burrito to me at 2 a.m. if I wanted some late night munchies, or was efficient enough to deliver medicine from a local CVS if my kid is running a fever and I need like a Robitussin delivered very quickly and I didn't want to leave the house. And so this app was actually built to try and connect a lot of us in our communities to local brick and mortar businesses. The problem is that as it grew in scale, it started to mean that you can almost get anything delivered these days. And in order to get delivery quickly and on demand and within 30 or 45 minutes, you need a very big workforce that's constantly working on and off. I think any of us that use Ubers or drive or Lyfts or have driven in them before to earn an income, we know that there's very good coverage. Like I can fire up my phone and right now I can actually find a Lyft in a few minutes. The pandemic has impacted that a little bit, but in general, we can find these on-demand transportations very quickly. And we found that a lot of workers who have been left out of the economy, that weren't getting paid enough in their other jobs or needed to have more than one job to make ends meet, they were looking to these apps like Postmates, like DoorDash, like Uber to fill in those gaps. And in 2017, that was a really darn good story to tell. We had a lot of lawmakers who actually came to our offices from DC, Congress people, senators, who, they wanted us to write a check because they're always fundraising in Silicon Valley, but they were actually there to learn about this technology and say, is this an important way to address the future of work, that anyone with an internet connection and a phone could download an app and start earning money? And this didn't just apply to food delivery like us, it applied to Airbnb, turning your most expensive asset into a income generator for sharing your home, turning your car into an ability to share your car. And this was of intrigue for a while. But over the years that I joined there, by the time of 2020, by the pandemic hit, in California alone, we had more than 100 and 90,000 drivers delivering food in just Los Angeles. Ford, the car company, has about 170,000 employees around the planet. So we were a massive source of income and a massive way in which people were seeking work and their jobs in a way that most companies had never seen before in the history of the globe. And that's because of the power of the internet. And there's a very low barrier of entry to work on these jobs. And I think this is important because it implies my work now at the ACLU. Even though these jobs were, jobs to patch together other modes of income, you got paid $17 an hour, not the greatest income in the world, not the worst. It meant for, if you were formerly incarcerated and you could download an app and start making money, that's way different than you getting rejected from a job place that has a prejudgment for you because you have a prior history. Or if you're a parent that is trying to earn money in between soccer practices, the ability to turn on an app and quickly access work as opposed to clocking in, putting on a uniform and clocking out, that is a meaningful way in which work can change. But in order for all of us to get these items in a few minutes, you kind of need a very elastic labor supply. If I went to Starbucks right now, chances are that the barista at Starbucks isn't also working for the Pete's Coffee across the street in the same hour. But if you drive on these apps, you can have Uber open, DoorDash open, Lyft open, and track multiple orders in real time, which means you're earning multiple income streams. And that means we swelled with the number of workers on the platform. And if we're talking about hundreds of thousands in just the state of California alone, if you times that by 50 states, that meant that we had to keep workers as independent contractors in order for the app to actually work. And at the same time, every presidential candidate who wanted to be a Democratic nominee in 2019, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, they literally pointed to our app and our company, as well as our competitors like Uber and DoorDash, and they said, screw you guys, you are paying wages because you're keeping all of them as independent contractors. And we were like, okay, but aren't we creating a lot of economic opportunity? Aren't we filling gaps and voids along the way where the economy has failed people? And there's a merit to that argument too, but I think the real answer is, how do we make these jobs better? If the economy isn't working for all, then yes, the government has some ownership and responsibility, but private companies too shouldn't just be out there for making jobs for the sake of making jobs. We should make good quality jobs. And so we embarked in a conversation in which we sat down with labor unions. We sat down with workers, gig workers on the platform. We sat down with the governors of California, Governor Newsom out here, and New York, or former governor of New York, Cuomo. And we tried to query whether we should reject this system in America where we have two types of work: a full-time worker who has to be a W-2 paid employee in order to get health care, or an independent worker that gets to choose their hours but has no retirement, no health care, no safety net. And so we asked, can there be a third way? Can there be a middle way where you get the benefits of the agility and flexibility of working on these apps? Because the internet was never contemplated when labor law was written in this country, but we build new benefits on top. And that was a question that every presidential candidate in 2019 paid attention to. And we tried to work with lawmakers in those states that I mentioned. We tried to work with Congress to try to establish this new category of work. But unfortunately, some of the dynamics were such that it was hard for us to craft a deal together, because the politics of a labor union are different than the politics of maybe a company, and different than the politics of a governor. And so in 2020, we actually, in California, the gig economy companies passed a law on the California ballot that actually created this brand new category of work, and it changed it in the California Constitution that now allows certain qualifying gig workers to get benefits in different ways. But I mentioned this story, and I know it's very long-winded and I'm rambling here, but I mentioned this story because a lot of the new technology that Michael and I had the opportunity to represent in government have spawned a lot of new industries. And a lot of those industries, they sort of have been growing rapidly overnight. We all know that just by being on Zoom, none of us probably really appreciated Zoom as a company or a tech company pre-pandemic. And now we're all very conversant in it post-pandemic or amidst the pandemic. And a lot of the digitization of everything in our economy is tapping into new areas where there hasn't been a lot of governance around your data or your worker rights or the way algorithms decide home loans for mortgages or not. And all of the items that we have to talk through, it starts by understanding, like, can we hold corporations accountable, and can we hold politicians and policymakers accountable to getting past their political differences that exist on both sides and craft new rules for the road. And I think I left those two experiences of government and tech recognizing that the public sector and the private sector need to be working partners, not sparring partners, especially at this moment in US history where digital tech is guiding a lot of our economic recovery. And unless we add rules that are balanced and clear-eyed, we won't necessarily have an economy that works for all. It might be inequitable. It might work for some. It might be that the person who gets to order food in Baltimore, Maryland, is in a very different income bracket and lifestyle bracket than the person delivering that food in Baltimore, Maryland. And how do we have that conversation? When I left tech in January, I actually wrote a very long memo to all the CEOs of Uber and Lyft and some of the other companies that I work with day to day on this, in this space, and said that we've got a lot of money as tech companies, but unless we actually sit down with labor unions and try and figure out how do we create a new 21st century class of worker protections for the driverless car era, or for the internet through your phone era, or the automation is here to change the jobs of, database entry folks and everyone in between. Unless we have a dialogue with industry and unions together, we're not going to be able to move the ball forward in a way that's equitable. And Germany, as an example, is really good about this, because Germany is very advanced in its manufacturing capacity. But anytime they build new technology, they make sure that universities are informed of the new state of the art, so that way they can inculcate that in their classroom teachings. And they make sure that labor unions are informed, so that way they can train workers for this new technology. That's the kind of feedback loop we need to build between these new types of tools in this country and these new types of regulations in this country. But I kind of felt like everybody probably in the last year, that none of that matters, frankly, and pardon my language, that unless like that economy is more accessible for everyday people. And right now that access means being able to just walk to a store and not necessarily feel like you need to be attacked because of the color of your skin, or because you're a transgender kid in Arkansas or Texas, which just last week signed a bill saying that transgender kids can't participate in certain sports teams unless it matches their gender at the age of birth. Or if you were evicted in the last year and you don't have a path to a lawyer, a free lawyer that can help you with an eviction, which doesn't exist in housing court. Some of these very basic structural elements of how we get housed, how we feel treated, how we access reproductive care, which as you all know, has notably been essentially banned in the state of Texas. All of those dynamics, I think, are so core to everything we learned in the last year about racial equity and social justice, that I kind of felt that working on those issues were also going to be really important ways in which we can create a little bit more equity in everyday communities upon which an economy is built. And that has paid a lot of interesting dividends, because as you know now, I think it was the Major League Baseball MLB All-Star game last year was canceled in the state of Georgia when Georgia passed a bad voting rights bill. And right now there's a conversation in Texas about whether or not certain companies might boycott Texas based off of their recent anti-trans and anti-abortion laws. And not to say that we need to make all of this political all the time, but I think that as someone that's worked in the private sector and knows the incentives of how these companies can behave and can be forms of economic pressure when there's an assault on civil rights, has informed my ability to be a little bit more savvy in this now civil rights organization, which ultimately informs my ability to think about how we think about an equitable economic recovery during COVID. So I know that's a lot, but I feel like that story is a little bit about how I make sense of going from Barack Obama to burrito delivery to now civil liberties.
I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit, Vikram, about how the ACLU does the work that it does, and also, like, is there a part of the work of ACLU that's particularly interesting to you or important that you think is important?
Yeah, I think you know, it's not a single issue organization. We tack on, we're tackling right now a lot of issues with children who have been separated from their families at the border and how they can get reunified. We're tackling a lot of voting rights issues around the country. I know Congress notably has a big voting rights bill in front of it that we've not been able to pass, but a lot of states have been trying to, in our opinion, dismantle voting rights in a somewhat racially motivated way, but more often than not, a politically motivated way in terms of where GOP interests are vis-a-vis Democrat interests. And then we separately have spent a lot of time on LGBTQ issues right now for those of us paying attention to Congress and whether or not they'll pass this big infrastructure package. We are lobbying on a piece of that pie that would increase funding for home care services for seniors and home care services for those with disabilities. So there's a lot of different areas where we can point the ACLU battleship and brand, so to speak. And I think the ACLU brand probably only got, I mean, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong or not, but sort of skyrocketed even further after Trump came to office because there were so many attacks, you know, the Muslim ban dropping in 2017. There was so much interest in the ACLU and what it was doing that the ACLU, instead of just being a legal organization, which tends to sue in court and all the way up to the Supreme Court, started becoming much more of a political organization of how do we run legislation, organize in communities, change hearts and minds, support certain candidates with the art of not full on endorsing certain candidates, which is an ACLU kind of tightrope that we try and walk. So there's a lot to do. I personally am deeply, deeply concerned by at least two fronts. One is the attack on reproductive rights in this country. I think that it's one thing to see it as just an abortion matter when it comes to people that might have disagreements over that. But I think at its core, it's a healthcare matter, and it's actively precluding people from, or recent legislation, including Texas, and then another legal case that will be heard in front of the Supreme Court from Mississippi, really do undercut the ability to get reproductive care and health care, you know, at any point during, you know, right before pregnancy, before a mother might even know that they're pregnant, to well after they're in the further down in the line in the pregnancy. And I think that that is a huge concern because what it's doing is creating, it's both risking a person's healthcare and well-being by forcing them to seek treatment outside of their own state. Can you imagine if we had to fly anywhere to get like a vaccine, for example, for COVID or get a flu shot? So it's risking health, but it's also risking, you know, there's economic consequence. If 22 states in this country invalidate access to abortion, then that is going to create a tourism, for lack of a better term, of healthcare in other markets, which can be hurtful for the states in which some of those harmful laws are taking birth as well, or taking root as well. Sorry, pardon the pun. So I do think that's a really big component that the ACLU is working on. And some of that work actually is trying to look at, should the ACLU get a little bit more involved in how people get into the pipeline to become judges on the state Supreme Court, because the state Supreme Courts are often where a lot of these cases kind of get memorialized. We're also looking at how do we expand access to abortion in existing states that are friendly for abortion rights. So that's sort of one category. The second category that is deeply nerve-wracking is the attack on the transgender community. It does seem like this is a new frontier of culture wars, but it is being anchored, you know, culture wars meaning as an extension of gay marriage having now been situated by the Supreme Court in the Obama years. This is really deeply sad, and it's not only hateful, but it's being targeted at kids. And I think that in many respects, in the same ways that in the one could have argued that politicians in the 90s didn't take vocal stances on gay marriage, for example, because there wasn't enough of a public discourse in the zeitgeist of that your pastor may be, you know, of a persuasion, or your friend, or your own neighbor, or you yourself. I think now what we need to do is create the conditions for more discussion and more awareness of people of all stripes being seen, whether you're of a certain gender persuasion, or non-conforming, or binary, or non-binary, or intersex, because what we're doing by allowing this legislation to take root is keeping people in certain shadows and feeling deeply unsafe to be themselves. And we risk as a society repeating a lot of the vengeful crimes that still exist in this country, but certainly hate crimes against, you know, lives like Matthew Shepard, that became household names in the pursuit for gay rights and marriage equality. And that bums me out deeply. I think that's an understatement. But I think that the fact that at least for me, my political persuasion is clear, but it means that the opposition is using this as an organizing and rallying cry. And that's concerning. I do think that there are probably lots of parents out there who are understandably uncertain or unclear on how they should approach these conversations if this is not something that they've engaged in from a lived experience themselves. And I think that the only way that we equip more families and communities with the tools that they need to address whether, you know, if it's anything from their child wanting to use different pronouns, to dressing differently, to seeking gender affirming care, that's a spectrum of things that any family will never take lightly, no matter where you sit on this issue. But for us to not actively try and with everything in our toolkit to try and make sure that that conversation starts first and foremost with an acknowledgement that you are free to be you and exist as you, however you define that, that's going to result in some challenges, tectonically, generationally hurtful challenges for this modern generation. And so the ACLU is tackling a lot of the transgender bills moving across the country right now, as well as a lot of the reproductive rights bills moving across the country right now.
That's incredible, and it's so interesting. Roberta Buckbird has a comment before you started talking about this, about the issue of the trans children and not being able to get puberty blockers and other health related care. So I think, you know, these things have touched a lot of us, and a lot of us do care really deeply about issues of equity and fairness and justice and et cetera, et cetera. And I know the ACLU is working towards legislation. What would you recommend that someone who doesn't work for the ACLU, are there certain steps that we as the public or citizens you would recommend that we consider?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, if those issues resonated, for example, or if those issues did not resonate, but there are other kind of concerns that you have across a range of civil liberties that you'd like to stand up for, you know, Asian American hate crimes have spiked in this country. And, you know, I know that's an area of focus for a lot of my own friends and family. Voting rights have been attacked in different parts of this country. So whatever your sort of issue set or that makes you concerned, the ACLU has been tackling a lot of these. So I would welcome you all to go to aclu.org and navigate that. But I'm going to quickly try and, on the two issues that we talked about, I wanted to put in the chat a couple of links that might just be informative to you in terms of what the work is that we're doing, and what steps that you can take to take actions around them. I will say, for those of you in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, which I think most, if not all of you are, on December 1st, there will be a fairly large rally on the steps of the Supreme Court. That is the day that the Supreme Court will be hearing a lawsuit called Dobbs versus Jackson, Mississippi Health. And that is actually not about whether abortion can be banned at 6 weeks. It's actually about abortion being banned at 15 weeks, which many of us might think like, well, what's the difference if this Texas law is already on the book at 6 weeks? But what's different in this case is that the case will actually call the question of Roe v. Wade and whether Roe v. Wade should be overturned. We're deeply nervous because the Supreme Court has a conservative majority and certainly 3 Trump appointees. I think 3, on the court. So we're trying to exert as much atmospheric pressure on this being a matter that is a healthcare matter, a civil liberties matter, a a human decency matter. And so I think strengthening number on the December 1st would be useful. And there should be information about that march here as well. But if not, I can send it to you, Rebecca, afterwards, and we can
Sure. Yeah. And, speaking of, I've been to the ACLU website, and there are lots of different issues that are being tackled, and it's really, really fascinating. One of the things that, that draw my attention, I'm like super practical minded, like, what works, and, just do petitions work? Do rallies work? What is like the most effective way, do you think, writing your legislators? If we had, the ACLU divides it up into, if you have just a few minutes, if you have some time, and then if you have all the time in the world, because some people are, we're all along part of that spectrum. Is there, like, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck, do you think?
That's a great question. I actually spend a lot more time thinking about, we all get a lot of junk mail, and around election season, we get like all of the mailers from candidates on different issues. And, a lot of campaigns spend money on that. A lot of candidates spend money on yard signs. Increasingly, a lot more candidates are spending money on Facebook ads and Instagram ads and digital campaigning. A lot of Senate offices are getting calls every day from different interest groups, in which we'll send out a connector line, and I'll say like, hey, John, or hey, Roberta, if you want to like call your member about this issue, all you need to do is press this button and we'll connect you right now. And it'll take you 15 seconds to convey your thoughts. I mean, there's a lot of different tactics that are out there. Maybe I'll answer it this way. I think some of the most effective tactics can be when you are creating the type of pressurized environment where you can't ignore the issue, regardless of whether you believe that in that position. So that, I mean, is there's no one specific silver bullet, I think. And I don't mean that as a cop-out answer, but if you're a lawmaker, like right now, I'll give you an example. In Delaware, there was a bill that would expand protections for people who are not able to pay their rent and are about to be kicked out of their home. There's usually an eviction proceeding that happens, but landlords always show up with lawyers, and tenants usually don't have the ability to access lawyers. And we believe in America that the judicial system should come with, the right to counsel. That's why we have public defenders in every jurisdiction, but we don't have that for people who are facing evictions. So we thought simply expanding the protection of the right to have a lawyer when you are going through an eviction proceeding might help reduce the rate of evictions, because you're going in there a little bit more clear-eyed and be able to stay in your home a little while longer, not ignoring the obligation you have to pay rent, but just being able to have a fighting chance. And there was one key lawmaker who threatened, or not threatened, but blocked the ability to advance that bill. And we found out that that's because they receive a lot of money from landlords and landlord groups and development groups. And so I think if they or their staff happen to be scrolling on Instagram one day or just shopping online, and we targeted an ad that said, hey, this lawmaker is prioritizing special interests over your ability to stay in your home, call them out and, click this button, sign this petition. If they just see one of those, that might annoy them, and they might flag it via email for staff, like, hey, y'all, something's going on here. But if we start to hammer them with the direct mail that we all throw away, TV ads, releasing polling data showing that they're on the wrong side of history, then that starts to create a surround sound that can kind of force them to have to respond. And so we tend to think like an all of the above approach is important, but you don't also have all the money in the world to do that. And TV ads and some of these things can quickly get very expensive. So sometimes we pick and choose. I will say the opposite extreme of that, though, for any of you guys following Senate politics, we keep hearing the name Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. One of the colleagues on my team spent a lot of time in West Virginia. And when he's been watching TV, every single ad is an ad just for Joe Manchin about his votes or his blocking of certain things in Congress. And then you also have to ask yourself, is that diluting the airwaves too much to the point that it's not effective? And so there's a lot of political consultants and campaign hands end up focusing on these questions as to what's the most effective. But I think as far as we're all glued to our phones, we're going to be seeing a lot more digital creative digital approaches in the coming years, and that's going to continue to be high above them, even more so than some of the other tactics that we mentioned, like TV ads or mail.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to actually another question that's in the chat, because but looking at it from such a different perspective, because there's also I mean, what's in the news today is that Facebook has been or other platforms of social media have been promoting misinformation or disinformation, and so in terms of legislation, they're trying to kind of work that piece out. What are your thoughts on like content regulation in social media?
I think it's clear that social media platforms have become more of a megaphone than they ever once contemplated they could be. And I think it's clear that we need to establish rules to make sure that information is being disseminated responsibly, that we're minimizing misinformation that can harm public health or result in public violence, and that we're able to do so in a way that balances both the particulars of how these companies exist and the back end of their tech, while also looking out for the public good. That being said, those were a lot of words, and to actually do that well, you need to craft appropriate legislation. And I think that that's vexed lawmakers in a really tough way. And I empathize with not just members of Congress, but even state lawmakers who have not been able to get bills across the finish line to account for this quite yet, because it requires at least two things. One, a very delicate tightrope walk with not regulating free speech to the point that it tramples the First Amendment. And then two, to make sure that if you start creating carve-outs for certain types of speech, how do we make sure that that speech meets the mark of what we think is concerning, which is a little bit of First Amendment already, but also how is the company already seeking to do that? I think that a lot of us now, because we see headline after headline after headline on Facebook, are probably a little skeptical of what they do with earnest versus what they are just paying lip service to. So, but I do think my time in the private sector has led me to believe that some of the work that some of these companies do, it's complex, and their back-end architecture is complex also. And so we need to increase our literacy of how those platforms are working. And I think that requires a deep scrub into what trust and safety protocols do they have now? What are they kind of using internally to flag bad words or bad statements or falsehoods about public health, for example? How do they have a notice and takedown period? And is that sufficient? And if it's not sufficient, what remedies should we plus up or mandate we plus them up as? Some people would say that that education is happening right now. And I think we need more of it. And I don't think that just having a 7-term member of this US Senate wag their finger at Mark Zuckerberg every other Tuesday is getting education, right? We're going to need to have staff in Congress who maybe came from tech companies, or conversely, staff from the government work inside these tech companies to understand mutual incentives. I know that there have also been some very specific remedies, like a law called Section 230, which speaks to in the Communications Decency Act, which allows for content to flow freely in online marketplaces, and the place where it's hosted is not liable for that. So if I post something, bad or shitty on YouTube, it's not YouTube's fault, it's more so my fault. And should that be changed? And I think that a lot of lawmakers right now are being subject to a very strong lobbying effort from the tech industry. And you also have seen some tech within the tech industry that aren't as popular or visible as Facebook call for regulations upon themselves. And I think that that's going to be something that we have to continue to watch. And I guess my answer is regulation is important and it should come. I will admit that as not being a subject matter expert in this space, I don't know what the right balance is, but having bear witness to some of the debates, I know that finding that balance and enacting it in legislation and reducing it to written forms of law is going to take some work. But that's why I do believe that people should, if they care about the blossoming of new tools and technology, even though sometimes people pick a career in the public sector or in the private sector, I think that right now more than ever, tech needs to build more empathy for government, and government needs to build more empathy for tech to get that balance right. Otherwise, we're just going to keep shouting at each other, and I'm not sure that that creates the right kinds of outcomes either.
Yeah. Because this is being viewed by college students and those who tuned in tonight or who will watch the recorded version are going to be watching it because they do have an interest in public policy or advocacy. Do you have any suggestions for like a career path? I mean, your career path has gone, you've covered like the whole universe, but if you directly wanted to do that as your main career focus, do you have any suggestions for people just starting out who really want to make a difference in this way as a career?
Yeah. I think the first is feeling okay and feeling comfortable with not having to pick a lane or a path. I mean, I certainly have meandered a bit, and I find those experiences to be useful in a vast array of approaches. And sometimes I sort of feel that we all feel that we either have family pressures or social pressures or personal pressures that we need to pick a lane. And I know those pressures will persist no matter what I say in the next 2 minutes, but try your best to decouple yourself from them, because I think lived experiences throughout different arenas ends up building us more empathy, even if we decided we don't want to stay in that lane, or we do want to stay in that lane. I think be okay with that. And then more specifically, if folks are interested in organizing or volunteering with the ACLU on some of our issues, we have a volunteer-based organizing system in every state in the country. And so I'm happy. I think you have my email from the overall email that got sent out about today's event, but I'm happy to connect you to what those are. And then number 3, I do think that this sounds so Barack Obama hopey changey, but I do think that like some of our discussions that I tend to avoid the most politically tend to be back home in my own living room. My older brother, my family is from India. My older brother married an awesome human, and her family, we love her, we love them, but her family represents more of a Trumpian bend of the world than ours does. And I often avoid conversations, and sometimes that's because we just want to drink and eat and not talk shop. But sometimes I feel like those are missed opportunities to sort of humanize a perspective that sometimes we think that perspective is, we have a certain vision of a villain who defines that perspective. And I think sometimes just doing that in our own neighborhoods and our homes is important too. So, volunteering ACLU wise or just having community conversations are important.
I want to close by thanking you. I mean, what an incredibly rich, thought-provoking discussion you've provided us with, far-ranging and really important.